This episode is brought to you by the Madison Community Foundation. Even if you don't recognize that name, you will definitely recognize their impact. Through donations from people like you, Madison Community Foundation helped fund the creation of the Monona Terrace, the expansion of the Goodman Community Center, and the Madison Central Library. And their community impact grants support hundreds of local nonprofits. When planning your year-end giving, visit madisongives.org to donate. Start a donor-advised fund or leave a legacy with Madison Community Foundation. Kick off the holiday season early this year with the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra's performance of Handel's Messiah. Written in just 24 days, don't miss your chance to experience the most performed classical piece of music worldwide. Make it your new favorite holiday tradition and join the WCO and the Festival Choir of Madison at Bethel Lutheran Church on November 22nd and 23rd at 7 p.m. Tickets are available at wcoconcerts.org/Messiah. Today on CityCast Madison. The City of Madison officially has its budgets lined up for 2025. But throughout the year-long process of making tough budget decisions, two relatively new police oversight agencies faced heavy scrutiny, including possible elimination: the Office of the Independent Monitor and the Police Civilian Oversight Board. The city questioned these agencies' levels of output and then their value. They both got funding for another year, but at lower levels. So what is the work of the board and the monitor? And what have they accomplished so far? We sat down with one of the Office of the Independent Monitor's core staff, their newly hired data analyst, Greg Golumbic, to find out. It's Wednesday, November 20th. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Hi, Greg. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm here at the Office of the Independent Monitor.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking the time. You know, we spoke with your colleague last year, Robin Copley, the head of the Independent Monitor, about the creation of this first-of-its-kind office in Madison. And y'all now have that additional staff, including you, the data analyst. Remind us, what's the intent of your office and why was it created?
The intent of the office is to oversee policing in Madison. Among other things, investigate complaints, but also, actually more importantly, to monitor the police department, analyze what's going on, and to issue recommendations, and then to encourage the police department to actually adopt those recommendations to generate better outcomes. We report to a board, the Police Civilian Oversight Board. So those two together are the oversight mechanism that was created here.
Yeah, and, somehow the clock struck midnight and the Common Council adopted the 2025 budget. It's been a truly arduous budget season. And y'all, the Independent Monitor and the Police Oversight Civilian Board, were in some heat for a minute over your funding, on the chopping block to some degree, even if the referendum passed. Yes, it's like, you're like, yes, I know. Ultimately, the council voted to keep the monitor, but still took away some of your funding for next year. And I just want to ask, what are there takeaways from the budget process, like in terms of being under scrutiny like that from the city?
Well, one takeaway, I think one thing that's important is to actually maintain good communication between alders and city officials and our office. The more communication there is, the less likely those events will happen.
And that's why we're here talking to you. We're another body, the media.
Well, and actually another takeaway is we were set up specifically to be highly independent, because independence is actually required for proper police oversight. The problem is that when you have an office that's independent, city officials, they don't control it, and therefore there are often issues with funding.
So, after what was essentially a public audit from the city, has anything shifted for the office's work since? And, you referenced communication. Anything else?
I don't really know. It was only fully staffed recently. In fact, what happened in my case was Robin was in the process of hiring me, and then word came down from the mayor, do not proceed. And then ultimately, Robin was allowed to hire me, but only as an hourly employee, which is what I am right now. The full staffing is too recent to really take much from the incident with like the mayor and council.
Well, to take words from your piece, you put a piece out in Tone as a contributor. You're in a fragile and nascent space.
Yes, that is exactly correct. Actually, one huge concern I have is that alders are now talking about ordinance amendments, and those largely aren't needed. I can actually think of a few that might be beneficial, but what you're seeing here is the typical reaction of managers when something doesn't go the way they'd like, which is do something. And often that do something involves tinkering in very unhelpful ways. So, some of what's being talked about would compromise our independence. And we definitely want people in Madison to speak out against that.
So, it sounds like it's time to move forward. You have partial funding, but you still have a lot of work that you guys are committed to doing. And, I mentioned you recently wrote a piece for Tone Madison as a contributor about the Monitor. And the first sentence says that Madison has one of the most empowered and independent police oversight agencies in the nation. How so?
Actually, Madison's police oversight agency is very unusual in a number of ways. For one, it has both a board and an office of the independent monitor. Most police oversight agencies in the U.S. have either one or the other. Many police oversight agencies report directly to the mayor and therefore are subject to a great deal of political influence. We do not. We're actually set up to be, fully structurally independent. The Office of the Independent Monitor and the Police Civilian Oversight Board, they have subpoena power. Many police oversight agencies do not have that. We are empowered in a whole host of ways. And that was really a consequence of being the recommendation of the MPD Policy Procedure Review Ad Hoc Committee, and then the George Floyd protests happening. Prior to the George Floyd protests, the mayor had proposed an oversight mechanism, but it was really neutered, and it answered directly to her. It would not have had, for example, subpoena power. It would have been subject to, her decisions or influence. And it was disempowered in a host of different ways. Like one of our primary missions is to ensure that the recommendations of the ad hoc committee get implemented. Well, in her proposal, she'd written it up so that the only recommendations we could speak to were ones that MPD itself decided to adopt. So if MPD hadn't adopted or refused to adopt a recommendation, that neutered mechanism couldn't have actually, sought to encourage it. So we're actually highly empowered, and that's a great thing.
Yeah. And I can imagine it is exactly what you just described that we didn't end up getting in other cities. And it seems like this body that would be able to implement community standards without that really happening, which might actually lead to further distrust and disconnection. I did want to ask, can you describe the difference between the board and the monitor for us?
The board is a board of predominantly community members who are chosen by different community organizations. So each community organization nominates people, and then out of the people that the community organization nominates, the mayor and council can select one for each seat. And then you've got the Office of the Independent Monitor, which does the day-to-day actual hearing of complaints, analysis of complaints, data analysis, and we report to the board. Like the board is our supervisor. The board and the monitor each have different roles and responsibilities. For example, the board is supposed to annually review the police chief. So if we ever end up with a chief who is, really unsuitable, then the board can review that, and then that can go to the PFC for consideration of whether we need a new police chief. The independent monitor, in contrast, does not have that role, but has other roles. Yeah, each is critical.
Yeah, and so it sounds like it serves as a check and a community check on what's been called, some departments that have a lot of power in the city and power to use fatal force. I did want to ask, why is a monitor and a police civilian oversight board important for a city like Madison?
It's important for a host of reasons. Like I first got involved in working on police reform after an unarmed neighbor of mine was shot and killed by an MPD officer, Paulie Heenan, in 2012. And actually, over a 4-year period, there were 3 people, fatally shot by MPD officers within 3 blocks of my apartment. 2 of them were unarmed. One only was holding a seaweed rake. You really don't want that. You want to try to reduce the frequency of such events, and that's part of what we're about. Another example of a problem in Madison is we've got extreme racial disparities in policing outcomes, including arrest rates. People first became aware of this because of the Race to Equity report, and the problem still exists. We actually have among the worst racial disparities of any city in the nation. And again, this is something that you want to change. So our mission is actually to improve policing outcomes along these lines.
Mm-hmm. I'm so sorry to hear about your neighbor, and thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think that the Race to Equity report, how salient is it a decade later, but to know that the outcomes and the racial disparities still exist. This is one of the core reasons for the monitor.
Yes.
Is, for that something be done.
Yep.
And do you think your office could lead to additional police reforms in Madison?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So I'll give you a few examples of the reforms that I personally have been involved in, and then, one thing that we may be recommending. So the reforms that I've been involved in actually, I think, have made a substantive difference in police shootings and other problems. Like, for example, there was a committee called an all-door committee called the President's Work Group on Police Community Relations. And one of the things, and I interacted very heavily with them, and one of the things that I was suggesting was that MPD needed a SOP, a policy for how to deal tactically with people in an altered mental state. At that time, no such policy existed. And I was advocating for the creation of such a policy and to base it on something called Fife's Principles, where Jim Fife was an NYPD officer who was very reform-minded and created a set of principles to reduce adverse outcomes and deaths when dealing with people in an altered mental state. So that was adopted, and I think that's actually contributed to fewer incidents of that sort happening ever since 2016.
Well, of course, Tony Robinson here.
Tony Robinson
Jr.
Yep.
Yeah. Who was, in an altered state with substances. Yeah.
Exactly.
Was shot and killed on Williamson Street, just for folks who weren't around.
Yep. And then another recommendation that I basically originated, starting around 2016, I began advocating for a mobile crisis response unit that could deal with mental health calls, that could deal with inebriation calls. And I was advocating for something along the lines of the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, that became a recommendation of the ad hoc committee. And then alders moved to implement that, and that is now the CARES program. So these kinds of reforms have had major impact. An example of a reform that I think may well go into our first report is something called SIT-D training. Officers are subject to a lot of cognitive distortions. Those can include things like an us versus them thinking. It can include a lot of things. And when you're in the field and there's high cognitive demand on you from events that are going on, it's very easy to fall back into these cognitive distortions, and then that can result in bad outcomes. So one thing that was recently developed was something called SIT-D training, which is basically a kind of cognitive behavioral approach that training that occurs with officers. And it's shown to reduce use of force, to reduce officer injuries, and to reduce racial disparities in arrests. So that's reform that I think we'll probably be suggesting in our first report moving forward.
There's a lot there, and we certainly have seen the impact of CARES in Madison. So that kind of work and those sorts of recommendations are huge. We're going to keep talking about the work of the Office of the Independent Monitor, but first, let's take a quick break.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
You know, we're curious, does the office have outlined deliverables that are like due to the city, anything of that nature? You're the independent monitor, but are there any sort of outlined tangibles?
There are some. Like one is an annual report. So that's a clear tangible. And, both the Police Oversight Board and the Office of the Independent Monitor each are, required to generate these annual reports. And, with regard to MPD, we don't have power to force anything, but we can, for example, if MPD refuses to adopt a recommendation that has a very strong evidence base that clearly would help, we could go to the council and the council could order implementation of that recommendation. And, but much of our work is actually, using the bully pulpit of interviews like this to try to foster change in MPD.
Yeah. And, we started this conversation talking about communication and, also anchoring one of the core tenets of your office working is independence. That said, has MPD embraced you all? Like, is that something that needs to happen? Is there communication between you guys? Like in order for you, for instance, the data analyst to be able to do your work, does there have to be some sort of good relationship? What's that picture like?
There does need to be, a decent relationship. Like I've requested a bit of data from MPD so far, and, they've been very accommodating with that, so I appreciate that.
That's awesome.
If the oversight agency has a good relationship with the police department, that actually makes it more likely that the police department will adopt its recommendations. And, Sean Barnes has actually been, kind of decent about, being somewhat forward-looking around this. Having said that, of course, there's also, some resistance. Like often a police union will be a source of resistance, and that's been true here. But it could be worse. Like, there are places like Newark where the police union, constantly the oversight mechanism has been subjected to a barrage of suits from the police department, from the police union, I should say. And, that's not been true here. So I'm hopeful at this point.
That's good. And, knowing Chief Barnes's biography is, looking at his bio, he has this track record of being someone who's tapped for national reform and looking at police reform. So, and, obviously they rolled out the body cameras, in terms of like data and having the hard facts about what should be implemented, what shouldn't, and testing things out. That seems something that's very up his alley. I do want to ask, your office, obviously it's new. This is a new concept being implemented in Madison. Mm-hmm. And when we spoke with Copley originally, it was in very early stages. And I'm curious, where are you now? Like what's been accomplished so far?
There's actually been quite a bit accomplished so far. Like there had been community listening sessions. Those community listening sessions occurred, both with respect to, what the community wanted to see an independent monitor, and also a series of community listening sessions about the complaint form and the complaint process. And there were reports generated from those. There was the hiring of staff, the independent monitor, and then myself and Chioma, who's essentially the program manager. There's the complaint form that's now been generated. A complaint process has been worked out. And it may seem easy to, you just take complaints and you investigate. But given the complexities of around data records and everything else, it's not nearly that simple. Like one thing that had to be negotiated first before we could even proceed to taking complaints is a memorandum of understanding between our office and NPD that would govern how we access records. So there's been a whole series of achievements, but one thing that, would have been good in retrospect is if they were publicized more to the community at large, so they were aware of it.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what can the city or residents do to help y'all accomplish your goals?
Okay, for residents, if there are detrimental changes being proposed to the ordinances that govern us, then I think it would be very good for residents to then turn out and say, hey, we want this to stay independent. We want this to stay effective. For the city, of course, a bit more funding would be nice. I'm only a 60% time employee at this point. We could be encouraged in other ways. If people have complaints about, an interaction with MPD officer, it would actually be great if people came to us with such complaints. And, they can do that by filling out an intake form and then submitting it. And then, the independent monitor will meet with them, et cetera. And I'd also mention that intake form isn't just for complaints. Like if an officer has performed exceptionally well, you can also write the stuff up for a commendation.
Mm-hmm. That's huge. Well, we want this to be an ongoing conversation and to get updates from you for sure. But before we let you go, I can imagine with the bit of controversy surrounding your office during this 2024 budget season, there may have been parts of the media narrative or coverage or, just other folks' understanding of your work that might have gotten out of focus or out of context or just plain off. Is there one thing that you really hope or would want listeners to take away from this conversation to understand the monitor's work?
Actually, here is one. There's a lot of misinformation that's floated around, and it's important to understand we are not the complaint department. We are complaint guided. The complaints will investigate them, and they actually can guide us in developing good recommendations for MPD. But we're actually, as opposed to a disciplinary-based process, we're actually more of something that's very analogous to what's called problem-oriented policing. Problem-oriented policing is not, strongly focused sanctions. What it's focused on is problem solving to result in better outcomes. And we're basically doing that with NPD itself.
All right. Well, we will continue to see y'all's work and, as I said, have this be a continuing conversation. But Greg, thank you so much for taking the time and giving us an update and kind of a little bit of a better lens into what you guys have going on.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
That's Greg Golumbik, data analyst for the Madison office of the Independent Monitor. If you want to read Greg's Tone Madison piece supporting the Monitor's work, or learn more about these two city police oversight agencies, head to our show notes for some links. That's all for today, here on CityCast Madison. If you enjoyed today's show, why don't you share this podcast with someone who values their civil liberties? See you back here tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take great care.